Fantasy, as a genre, has a long history of borrowing things from our world. But the choice of what to take and what to leave has always left me a little baffled. Why do so many of our traditional classes in fantasy games hail from a Roman perspective of ancient Europe, in Druids and barbarians? Today I want to talk about the difference, or lack thereof, between Druids and Shamans, and why using both in a fantasy world is not only confusing, but a rather strange decision that should not be taken lightly. What is a Druid? And what is a Shaman? If you've ever wondered either of those questions, stick around till the end to find out. Because World of Warcraft and older editions of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games like it have perhaps done both a little bit of a disservice. So what is a Druid? Druids are a half-remembered fiction, and honestly, that's the way they'd probably want it. We only really have a few written historical accounts about Druidic practices, many of which exist across Britain's folklore and mythology, and some from the Romans. It's likely that very few of the authors of these sources actually lived for any great length of time within Druidic circles or under Druidic leadership, so we must doubt their testimony somewhat. Indeed, the Celtic and Gallic tribes that were led by Druids did not really have much practice in writing anything down themselves. We also have scant physical evidence of the Druids, as most of the land that was administrated by them later fell under Christian rule, which certainly contributed to the removal and destruction of evidence of pagan activity. But we must remember, just because Druids didn't write their histories down does not mean we should disregard them as uneducated. Becoming a proper Druid required an education, often at a sacred, centralised location for learning and teaching. They were trained from childhood all the way through to adulthood, only leaving education for the purpose of administrating their own community. Administrate is the right word. Ancient Druids were as much religious leaders and diviners as they were community leaders and judges. You see, Druid is a broad term of authority, encompassing storytellers, like with our traditional use of the word bards, religious and prophetic wise folk, being seers and ritual leaders, and tribal authorities, responsible for maintaining community and the rule of law in their particular groups, what the Romans referred to as Druids. Overlap is very likely to have occurred within these categories, and it is very likely that a particular Druid performed a specialised array of these duties to best suit his own community. In some ways, Druids were the glue of their communities, being not only philosophers, but wise folk, healers, and ritual leaders. Becoming a Druid was a vocation chosen from youth, with the goal of becoming the de facto decision maker for a clan, tribe, or social group. However, being a Druid also meant facing some hard truths. Druids were the arbiters of law, justice, and punishment in their clans. They were responsible for executing criminals as ritual sacrifices, and sometimes even sacrificing regular folk. Their prophetic duties often required bloodshed, which fit in well with their role as judge, jury, and executioner. Other tamer rituals involved offerings that were found within nature. Druids venerated sacred regions of forest, cut mistletoe in a ritual ceremony, and often through votive offerings into bodies of water, to try and send them to the other world. A world of spirits, be they the spirits of ancestors or the spirits of fey beings. Now to discuss how druids are presented in fantasy media. Oftentimes druids in media gain some aspects of neo-paganism, while losing out on some of the darker or more complex roles that they fulfilled within actual historic druidic circles. Extensive education from childhood all the way to adulthood and divination through entrails are often some of the first things to go when we're talking about fantasy druids, while we gain an imported fascination with the classical elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. Now we know that water was seen as a gateway to the other world. We know that druids venerated sacred groves, and we know that fire was used in druidic ritual. But a classical understanding of the four elements is of deeply anachronistic import into a druidic way of thinking, not least because it actually comes from the people who wiped out the Brythonic druids. A further feature comes to us most clearly through World of Warcraft and Dungeons and Dragons. Druids are presented in these games as shape changers. Shape-changing myths are relatively common in the British Isles, especially if we're talking about Celtic Irish myth. In these myths, almost every powerful entity is depicted as being able to change its shape in some way. Although it is definitely worth noting that in all of the Roman accounts, many of which reported what the local people believed about druids, there is pretty much no mention of a druid having any sort of shape-changing abilities. Now, the Romans were keen to be the druids' greatest detractors, to remove any sort of legitimate authority they may have and make them look monstrous, and a folk belief saying that druids could turn into wild beasts would certainly have helped their agenda of making the people of these isles look like unheeding, unchristian savages. While shape-changing myths exist all around the Celtic world, druids are not very often actually directly implicated in them. So it is strange that in the modern presentation of druids, shape-changing is considered a major or core power of theirs. Where Dungeons and Dragons and World of Warcraft do well, though, is representing the druids' social role. Druids are shown as not just priests, but community leaders who make decisions for their whole tribe. While there are too many trained druids in many of these druid groves across fantasy media, and while the notion of competitive levels of druid borne out by fighting over regional dominance is not terribly well correlated to how I understand the historical druid culture, their representations in Dungeons and Dragons and World of Warcraft do historical druids some amount of credit, at least as far as we can possibly know from the scant evidence we have about them. But in the World of Warcraft and Dungeons and Dragons, there is another version of the community priest, who is a leader of a tribal group, is able to commune with nature and the spirits thereof to perform magic. The Shaman is notably absent in 5th edition, but has been present in all other editions of Dungeons and Dragons, including, before the comments inevitably let me know, in Pathfinder. To some extent, avoiding the inclusion of the Shaman in 5th edition makes sense. Avoiding unfavourable or unfair presentations of real-world practices, cultures and faiths seems a reasonable enough step in a modern world of publishing, especially as the Shaman has traditionally been marred with a kind of primitivist concept for most of its media publication history, in fantasy at least. In past iterations of Dungeons and Dragons, it was the de facto method of giving monstrous races the ability to cast spells, as a counterpart to the Druid and Cleric, which were player classes which were somewhat sanitised from their historical roots, even from 1st edition. At least when we compare the practices of Clerics and Druids in early D&D to the practices of Clerics and Druids throughout human history. The reality is, shamanism is an extant modern-day religious practice, far more so than Druidic faith. Yes, neo-shamanism and neo-paganism are both popular New Age religious faith movements, but where Druidic practices were largely eliminated by or assimilated into Christian European culture, shamanism, at least as a term within the study of religions, still refers to a diverse set of actual faith practices practiced across the world, even to this day. It's worth noting that shaman is a contested and perhaps controversial term, but I'm going to offer a definition that should only be infuriating if you're perhaps one of my old lecturers in the study of religion. A shaman is a cultural and religious thought leader who is responsible for contacting the spirit world using methods such as trance for the purposes of divination and ritual. They often use music and natural cocktails to enhance and enable these practices, and some may subscribe to a form of animistic belief, which posits that the world around us is filled with living spirits, either spirits of nature or spirits of ancestors, creating an ancestral map around the local environment of the tribe. You will notice I am being a lot more specific than I was with Druids, in part because this is still an ongoing religious ritual practice, and partly because we have a lot more existing data written about these practices. Now, the documents I have access to are very rarely written by shamans or people who live in shamanic communities. I rely heavily here on ethnography, which places scholars within the communities for long periods of time to write about them, but necessarily imports a perspective of academic scholarship into a historic and established community where it may not fit. Nonetheless, from this picture I've painted, it is clear that Druids and Shamans share many similar features. Performers, religious and community leaders, with powers to commune with nature for the purposes of fostering a connection with the other world or the world of spirits. We should give the shaman the same respect we give to our mythologized account of druids. It's not simply mind-altering substances, trances, and spirit summoning. Shamanic practices, or really any indigenous religious practice, are as varied as they are complex, but almost always resolve into a picture of a leader, well versed in their own cultural practices, whatever those may be, acting as a qualified expert and ritual guide for their community. Shamanic practices can be observed as widely from India to Mongolia, from Africa to the Americas. The through line really is a form of spiritual authority mixed with the magical ability to access another realm, be it the realm of spirits or the realm of the divine. Much like with the essentialization of druids, shamanism has been boiled down and modified by modern media, although this time it echoes somewhat racist and reductive understandings of the other. Firstly, through D&D's first and second editions, Shaman was a class specifically reserved for monsters, which is not a good look. When it does become a player option, a Shaman is essentially just some cross between the Druid and the Cleric, with some shape-changing abilities to boot. Many attempts are made at this class in D&D and other media, including in World of Warcraft, which gives us some of our most enduring examples. In World of Warcraft, Shamans are only available to players of the Horde, which are often coded as more primitive than the Alliance. They summon totems on the field of battle and call upon, again, the classical elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, among others. Generally, they draw their powers from the elements, using it for healing, harming, and controlling a battlefield. Shamans in World of Warcraft are depicted as spiritual leaders and as spirit channelers and summoners. Both Druids and Shamans in our world have always been the spiritual anchor of their community. They both perform divination rituals and have varying degrees of authority depending on the community they are in. They have always been expected to be experts in healing and in contacting the other side, be that the other world or a world of animistic spirits. Really, Druids were shamans by our definition, and have only avoided that categorization because of the mysterious sense in which they disappeared in history, and possibly a tacit preference in the West for European forms of ancient faith over others. And seeing that Druids essentially were shamans, I see very little reason, in 5th edition at least, to reinstate the shaman as a class, as many homebrew designers have tried to do. Unless the intent is to demonstrate to a wider audience that shamanic practices are an extant reality of our world. Heck, maybe it's the druid that should be removed from our lexicon and replaced with a sense of general indigenous faith practices in a tribal communal setting. The only trouble is that whatever that new broader umbrella under which druids may sit is called, it probably shouldn't be shaman. Unfortunately, the word itself has a rather controversial history, and is also associated with many of the primitivizing problems that we've been discussing this whole time. There's no perfect solution, as there never is when you're dealing with the intersection between history, faith, and the modern and real world, especially if we're trying to stuff it all into an easily digestible understanding of fantasy. I hope you've enjoyed this look at what we mean when we say certain things, and that some of this information has been novel or interesting to you. If you want me to delve deeper into either of these faith expressions or any other, please do let me know. I myself have a couple of degrees in the comparative studies of religion, and I would be more than happy to give some more thought to the media presentation of faith. Although, it must be noted that I am certainly not infallible. I have almost certainly gotten a few things wrong in this video, and so if I have and you've noticed them, or you're a scholar far more versed in these sorts of things than myself, please do let me know in the comments. I appreciate the opportunity to learn from my community, which is why I try and read everything you guys write to me. In any case, I hope this has formed some thoughts in your mind, as I hope all of my videos do, and if it hasn't, I'm sorry. Better luck next time. With that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.